Here is a picture of Commander Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. Eisenhower will become in charge of all of the Allied command, but for right here, he's in charge of Operation Torch, and that is the invasion of North Africa. The war in the Balkans. So the next stage of the war that we're going to talk about is on the Eastern Front. Hitler always planned to invade the USSR. Even though he signed a non-aggression pact with them, his intent was to conquer all of Russia. He needed to take the Balkans first, because that's in southeastern Russia. To get to Russia, you would need that area strategically. So in 1941, under the threat of force, he incorporated Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary to join the Axis powers. However, they had very little power. They remained independent, but they basically were puppet governments that had to do what Hitler wanted. Yugoslavia was taken over by force. It lasted 11 days, and then Greece was also taken over by force, and it lasted 17 days. So they were both invaded and taken care of. And eventually the swastika will be on top of the Acropolis, which is the symbol of Greece. It's the old building from ancient Athens. After that, Hitler will invade the Soviet Union. His invasion of the Soviet Union was Operation Barbarossa, which happened on June 22nd, 1941. The Soviet Union was not very prepared for this. Stalin himself never thought that Hitler would invade. Even as he was invading, Stalin thought that it was some sort of miscommunication, or he refused to believe what was happening. So as a result, Hitler was able to push 500 miles into Russian territory. The Russians, however, did the same tactic they did with Napoleon. As they fell back, they completely destroyed everything in their path so that the Germans would have nothing that they could use. So they slashed and burned everything, food, houses, whatever they could. By September 8th of 1941, Leningrad was under siege. By November, the city was entirely cut off. Had no supplies coming in. The city was starved. It was constantly bombed, and it had 2.5 million inhabitants stuck in the city. People began to eat cattle that were used for farming outside the city. They then ate horses, rats, dogs, anything they could find to help out, because they had no food and very limited access to water. Between 1941 and 1942, more than 1 million people in Stalingrad died in the city, but the city did not give up, did not give in. Here we see a map of Operation Barbarossa that happened in 1941. Hitler and the Germans pushed in, captured several cities along the way. However, they never got to Moscow. They got close. They never took Leningrad in the north, but they did not achieve their goal. And you see the three-pronged attack here. One portion of the army would move north to take Leningrad. The main body moved towards Moscow, and then another part of the army moved south to cut off European Russia from the rest. Here you see some of the fighting in Russia. This is a Soviet tank. You see the German soldier here, and you notice everything's burning. As the Russians withdrew, as I told you, they began to burn everything in their path. Here you see the Germans advancing. What I want you to notice here is that the Germans have very little protective clothing from the elements. They invaded in the summer. They thought by November that all of Russia would be taken, so they didn't pack any of their winter gear. They were very quick moving with their blitzkrieg. Notice the infantry is riding on tanks and other troop carriers to keep up. October 2nd, 1941, the main body, as I showed you in the map, advanced on Moscow and came to the outskirts of the city. Stalin's number one general at this time was General Grigory Zhukov, and he planned the defense of the city and he also will be in charge of the Russian forces and the counterattack to get rid of the Germans. General Zhukov was successful in stopping the Germans from taking Moscow and was able to hold them up. And as the temperatures fell in Russia, so did the Germans. As I told you before, they only had summer uniforms. They did not have the proper clothing or material to withstand the winter. So as temperatures fell, they began to retreat back so they could regroup and then press their attack. But Hitler was set in his ways and wanted to conquer the Soviet Union, so he ordered for no retreat. So his troops dug in about 125 miles from Moscow, and that line is where they're basically going to be held off until 1943, when the Russians go on the offensive. During this campaign, the Germans lost 500,000 men, and shortly thereafter, this time the United States is going to get involved in the war. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about Japan in the Pacific. So we've already talked about Japan in Chapter 31, taking over lots of territory in the Pacific. Now we'll talk about how the United States gets involved, and we'll very briefly go through some of the things that happen there. So Japan at one point has been cut off from all oil and materials from the United States. So they make the decision that they need to eliminate the United States from ever entering the war. So their plan is to attack Pearl Harbor, and that will knock out the entire United States Navy and force them to the bargaining table. And at the same time, they're going to attack U.S. assets all on the Pacific and gain more and important oil fields in that area. So they attack Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, and Thailand. And they are very successful. The United States was not anticipating a war with Japan in those areas, so they had very little defenses there. So Guam and Wake Island fall. January of 1942, Pearl Harbor marches on the Philippines and takes the capital of Manila. The United States and Filipinos held off for a long time on the Bataan Peninsula and along the island of Corregidor. However, by April, Bataan had fallen, and by May, the island fortress of Corregidor will also fall. It's at this same time that General MacArthur is ordered off the island and is then makes his bold statement that he will return to the Philippines and liberate it. Hong Kong, Malaya, and Thailand will also fall to the Japanese. And then in February of 1942, Japan will take Singapore. The Japanese also conquered the Dutch East Indies, so the islands of Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and Celebes, and Burma, which is present-day Myanmar, also fell. There was also a planned attack on India. However, the British forces are able to hold off the Japanese from doing that. The slogan for the Japanese was East Asia for the Asiatics. Now, they could have probably been successful had they come in and allowed those people to be free and independent. However, they were worse than the colonial overlords that were there. So they were very oppressive, and people began to lash out against them. They were also very terrible to their prisoners of war. When Bataan and Corregidor fell, they forced those prisoners to march 50 miles. They were given no water, very little rest, no food. They had to carry the wounded with them. There's 70,000 people that started. By the time the march ended, only 54,000 remained. If you fell out at all, you'd be stabbed, bayonet, and killed. Many people died of exposure, starvation, and dehydration. So now the Allies, then after quite some time, will stop the Japanese from conquering, and then will go on the offensive. One of the first offensive things against the Japanese were the Doolittle raids. Colonel Doolittle took existing technology and adapted it so that he could have a long-range bomber that could bomb Tokyo. To do this, he had to strip down existing planes of basically everything except bombs and fuel, take parts off these airplanes. He also had to train pilots to take this plane and be able to fly it on a very short runway. The plane was not designed for use on an aircraft carrier, so he had to train his pilots how to take off on a shortened field. And if they didn't, they'd end up in the ocean. His men were successful. They bombed Tokyo. They then banked hard left and then used remaining gas to get over China, and then had to jettison and parachute out and make their way into unoccupied China, where the friendlies were. Now, the raid didn't do much. They hit their targets. They eliminated some buildings and things like that. But overall, didn't do much for the war effort other than psychologically it showed that they could attack even their capital city and that no one in Japan was safe. So the Allies will begin to turn the tide after this point. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, this is an air war. Planes from aircraft carriers were launched and they fought each other and then fought against also each other's ships. The Allies lost more equipment and men, but stopped the Japanese from advancing and taking Australia, so it was a victory for them. Then came the Battle of Midway. The Japanese decided that they were going to deliver that knockout blow that they did not at Pearl Harbor. So what they're going to do is get the main body of their force ready at Midway Island and move them towards that direction, while a ghost force would move up and pretend to attack Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. Their thought was that the United States would bring its entire fleet to protect Alaska, and then the main body of the Japanese fleet would then ambush them along their way at Midway Island. Well, codebreakers from the United States found out what their plan was and decided to set an ambush for them and get their ships to Midway Island first. And then once that happened, they would ambush the Japanese ships as they started to come that way. So they allowed the attack on the Aleutian Islands to happen and surprised the Japanese fleet and inflicted heavy losses on them. This will turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. The Japanese lost 332 planes, 4 aircraft carriers, and 1 support ship. And when this happens is, during these battles, the Allies, especially the United States, can make new ships, new planes very quickly, very easily. From start to finish, it would take 3 days for a battleship to be built, which is very, very quickly. We also had the materials to rebuild them. Japan did not. So every time they're losing men and material, they can't replace them as quickly as we can. Then the Allies will go on the offensive. They adopt an island hopping campaign using the Marines under Douglas MacArthur. They would take strategic locations, set up new bombing bases, leapfrog to the next island, the next island, the next island towards Japan. First, Guadalcanal was the first offensive, and the rest of the Solomon Islands. So on August 7, 1942, 7,000 Marines invaded the island. The Japanese lost somewhere between 24,000 to 36,000 troops. They were fanatical. They did not surrender by choice, and even when they did, they would oftentimes be booby-trapped. Next, we will shift gears in the next segment and go and talk about the Holocaust.